The dock workers in the port of Messina were expecting a normal morning. 12 Genoese grain ships had been spotted on the horizon, coming in from the Black Sea. The harbor master was preparing his manifests. Workers moved along the quay, ready to unload the cargo. Ships from the east arrived every week. There was nothing unusual about this. The ships docked, the workers approached, and then they stopped. Most of the sailors on the first ship were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black swellings the size of eggs in their armpits, at their groins, along their necks. The swellings were weeping blood and pus. The men on deck could barely speak. They reached out toward the dock workers with hands that were already blackening at the fingertips. The harbor master ordered the ships out of the port immediately. They left, and it was already too late. By the end of the following year, between a third and half of every living person in Europe would be dead. Not in a war, not in a famine, not across a generation. In 12 months. The disease that arrived in Messina that October morning in 1347 would kill more human beings in less time than any event in recorded history. It would empty cities, collapse economies, shatter the medieval church, and permanently alter the course of European civilization. The lowest credible estimates put the death toll at 25 million. The highest approach, 50 million. In a continent of roughly 80 million people, those numbers mean something close to extinction. At the time, people called it the Great Pestilence. The name Black Death came later, a description by historians of what survivors had reported: the blackening skin, the dark swellings, the color of the bodies stacked in pits faster than the living could fill them. This is the story of what happened, but it is also the story of something harder to look at than the dying. It is the story of what people did when they had no explanation, no cure, and no way out, and had to decide, in the space of a few days, who they were. The plague did not originate in Sicily. It had been moving for years. The bacterium at its center, Yersinia pestis, had circulated in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppes for centuries. Something changed in the 1330s and 1340s. Climate shifts, disruptions to rodent populations, and the expansion of Mongol trade networks along the Silk Road created conditions for the pathogen to spill into the human world at a scale it had never reached before. By 1346, it had arrived at Kaffa, a major Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. The Mongol forces of Khan Jani Beg were besieging the city, and they were already dying of the plague when they arrived. According to Gabriele de Mussi, a notary from Piacenza who recorded the events, the Khan ordered the bodies of his dead loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls. Whether this was deliberate biological warfare or simply an expedient way to dispose of corpses, historians still debate. What is not debated is the result. The plague entered Kaffa. The Genoese merchants fled by ship. They took the plague with them. And here is the thing about those ships. The harbor master in Messina ordered them out of port within hours of arrival. The 6 sailors were expelled. The vessels were turned away. On paper, the threat had been contained. But nobody looked in the hold. Every grain ship that crossed the Mediterranean carried rats. Not a few, hundreds. They lived in the cargo, fed on the grain, nested in the ropes and timber. They had been there for the entire voyage from the Black Sea, and the rats on those 12 ships were sick. Not visibly sick, not in any way that a sailor would notice or a harbor master would think to check, but infected, carrying the same bacterium that was killing the men on deck. And the rats, unlike the sailors, were not expelled. They slipped off the ships in the dark, the way rats always do. Down the ropes, along the quay, into the warehouses and granaries of Messina. They moved into the city's food stores, into the walls of the city's homes, into the markets and the churches and the narrow streets where people lived on top of one another in the dense, crowded way of medieval port towns. They brought their fleas with them. Each flea was carrying the same bacteria. When an infected rat died, its fleas left the body and looked for a new host, the nearest warm-blooded creature available, usually another rat, sometimes a sleeping child, sometimes a baker reaching into his grain sack before dawn. The bite was nothing, a small itch, the kind of thing you barely noticed. 3 days later, the swelling began. This was how it moved, not through the 6 sailors the harbor master had expelled, but through 1,000,000 tiny bites in 1,000,000 ordinary moments that nobody connected to anything, because nobody had any reason to look at a dead rat in a warehouse and see the end of the world. The ships were expelled. The rats stayed. And within days, Messina was burning. The Sicilian authorities, when they realized what was happening, sent the ships away from Messina, to Genoa, to Venice, to every major port on the Italian coast. Each ship carried more rats. Each port of call became a new origin point. The infected rat population spread outward through every granary and market in every city the ships touched, and the fleas spread with them, and the bites multiplied, and the swellings began appearing in city after city with a speed that seemed impossible. And then the disease found an even faster way to travel. When the bacteria reached the lungs of a person already dying, when the plague turned pneumonic, it spread through coughed breath alone, no flea required. A sick man in a marketplace, a dying woman tended by a daughter who then went to church. Each breath a transmission. The rat brought it to the city. The flea brought it into the house. The cough brought it across the room. By December 1347, the plague was in Genoa. By January 1348, it was in Venice and Pisa. By spring 1348, it had crossed the Alps. It would reach Paris by summer, London by August, Scandinavia by 1349, the far north of Russia by 1351. There was almost nowhere in the known world it did not eventually touch. No wall stopped it, no prayer stopped it, no king, no pope, no physician had the faintest idea what it actually was. But it was Italy where it struck first, hardest, and where the people who lived through it left behind the words that tell us what it felt like from the inside. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio was living in Florence when the plague arrived in spring 1348. He survived it. He described it in the prologue to the Decameron as testimony to what had happened in his city, not a medical account, but a human one, from someone who had walked the streets and watched the dying and could not look away. He described how it began, a swelling in the armpit or the groin, growing to the size of an apple or an egg, hard and painful, the skin around it turning dark. Physicians called these swellings buboes. Some tried lancing them. Some bled their patients. Nothing worked. The infection then spread outward, producing black and purple blotches across the skin, a mark so associated with the disease that later generations would name the entire epidemic after the color. Some died within 3 days of the first swelling, some within 2. Some appeared healthy in the morning and were dead by nightfall. Florence lost roughly 60% of its population, somewhere between 45 and 60,000 people, in a city of around 90,000. The courts shut. The churches ran out of space. In the end, Boccaccio wrote, "The dead were stacked in layers in pits, the way ships are loaded with cargo, bodies and earth, until the pit was full and a new one was dug." He described something else that would echo through every account of the Black Death from every corner of Europe. He described the abandonment. Neighbor abandoned neighbor, brother abandoned brother. What horrified Boccaccio most was not the symptoms. It was watching people who had loved each other all their lives turn away from the dying because they feared becoming the dying. Servants refused to enter sick rooms for any wage. Fathers left children on doorsteps. Husbands and wives said goodbye through doors they would not open. The social order that had defined medieval Europe, the obligations of family, the duties of the church, the hierarchy of lord and peasant, dissolved in weeks. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but enough that everyone who witnessed it recognized that something fundamental had broken, and in the middle of all of this, in the Tuscan city of Siena, a shoemaker and tax collector named Agnolo di Tura was writing it down. He had 5 children. He had a wife named Nicoluccia. He had lived a modest, ordinary life in a prosperous medieval city. By September of 1348, every single one of them was dead. In his chronicle, he described watching victims swell beneath their armpits and in their groins, and fall over dead while talking. He described fathers abandoning children, wives abandoning husbands, brothers abandoning brothers, because the illness seemed to spread through breath and sight alone, and no bond of love felt worth the risk of standing too close. He wrote, "There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death." He wrote something that no historian's summary has ever made unnecessary. "I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." He survived, he remarried. He kept writing because the chronicle had to be finished, because someone had to put it down. There was one more detail he recorded about Siena in 1348, and it is the one that stays with you longest. At the time the plague arrived, the city was in the middle of constructing what was meant to be the largest cathedral in Christendom. The foundations had been laid, the walls were rising. Within weeks, the construction was abandoned. The workers were dead. The money was gone. The ambition that had driven the project had evaporated entirely. The unfinished nave stands in Siena to this day. You can walk through it. The walls rise to about a third of their intended height and stop, stone cut and positioned by men who were dead within months of placing it. There was one question driving everything in spring and summer, 1348, in every city, in every language, in every social class. Why? Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria. The dominant explanation, endorsed by the University of Paris in a 1348 report commissioned by the King of France, was that a catastrophic conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars on March 20th, 1345, had corrupted the air. Corrupted air entered the body through the pores. Corrupted bodies died. The practical response: avoid bad air. People burned aromatic herbs. They carried flowers. They sealed their windows. They fled to the countryside. None of it worked against a bacterium, but it was not irrational. It was careful reasoning from catastrophically insufficient information. Other explanations competed. God's wrath, the accumulated sins of a generation. These carried their own implications. If the plague was divine punishment, what was needed was not medicine, but repentance. And some people took that idea further than anyone in authority had anticipated or wanted. From this belief was born one of the strangest mass phenomena of the 14th century, a movement that began as an act of desperate faith and ended as something much darker. In 1349, groups of men began appearing on the roads between German and Flemish towns, marching in processions of hundreds or thousands, dressed in white robes marked with red crosses. They wore iron-tipped leather straps on their backs. As they walked, they sang hymns in Low German, specific songs written for the movement, describing Christ's suffering and calling on God to spare humanity from the pestilence. When they reached a town, they formed a circle in the market square, stripped to the waist, and began to beat themselves with their straps until the blood ran freely down their backs and soaked into the cobblestones around them. Between blows, they prostrated themselves in specific ritual patterns, arms spread wide in the shape of a cross, lying face down in the dirt, then rising again for the next round. The ritual was precisely prescribed. 33.5 days of marching, 1 day for each year of Christ's life on earth, with 3 sessions of flagellation daily. No bathing, no sleeping in beds, no changing of clothing. The dried blood and dirt that accumulated on their robes was considered a mark of holiness. The whole enterprise was an attempt to outbid the plague, to suffer more than they feared it would make them suffer, and through that excess of pain, to tip the balance of divine justice back toward mercy. Crowds gathered wherever they arrived. Women wept. Men joined the processions mid-route. The blood-soaked straps were treated as holy relics. In some towns, people reportedly dipped cloths in the blood and pressed them to their eyes. The movement spread with a speed that matched the plague itself. By mid-1349, flagellant processions had been reported in the Low Countries, in England, in France, in the German-speaking lands from the Rhine to the Baltic. They arrived in a town, performed their ritual, and moved on. Some groups began claiming that their suffering was sufficient to replace the sacraments of the Church entirely, that confession to a priest was no longer necessary, that the blood they shed was itself absolution. This was the point at which Pope Clement VI, who had been watching from his court at Avignon, decided he had seen enough. On October 20th, 1349, Clement issued a papal bull condemning the flagellant movement outright. He declared their theology heretical. He ordered church leaders across Europe to suppress the processions. The flagellants, he argued, were not saving souls. They were spreading disorder and bypassing the very institutional structures through which God's grace was transmitted. The condemnation worked, not immediately and not completely, but within a year, the processions had largely dissolved. What had seemed like an unstoppable movement collapsed almost as quickly as it had appeared. But by then, the flagellants had done something that would echo far longer than their processions. Wherever they marched, they preached that they knew the cause of the plague. It was not God's wrath. It was not corrupted air. It was not the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. The Jews had poisoned the wells, and within months, that accusation would produce a wave of killing that historians have called the largest single wave of anti-Jewish violence in European history before the 20th century. This accusation had not originated with the flagellants. It had been circulating since early 1348, spread by rumor and then by torture. In the Swiss towns of Bern and Zofingen, Jews had been arrested and subjected to judicial torture. Under torture, they had confessed to the well poisoning conspiracy. The confessions were sent to other cities as documentary proof. Cities that had not yet been struck by plague used the confessions as justification for preemptive action. In January 1349, the entire Jewish community of Basel, 600 people, was burned at the stake. They had been locked inside a wooden building constructed specifically for the purpose on an island in the Rhine. The plague had not yet reached Basel when the burning took place. On February 14, 1349, the entire Jewish community of Strasbourg was burned alive in the city's Jewish cemetery. There were approximately 2,000 of them. The plague had not yet reached Strasbourg either. Jakob Twinger von Königshofen, a priest historian who documented the event, recorded that once the flames were extinguished, the Christian residents of Strasbourg moved through the ashes and collected whatever valuables had not been destroyed. All debts owed to Jewish creditors were canceled. The city council divided the seized cash among the tradesmen's guilds. On March 1, 1349, the Jewish quarter of Worms was set on fire. Over 400 members of the community died. Many of them set fire to their own homes rather than face the mob. In Mainz, then the largest Jewish community in Europe, the Jews fought back. They killed over 200 of their attackers before the neighborhood was overwhelmed. Pope Clement VI issued a bull in September 1348, stating plainly that the well-poisoning accusation was false. Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, he pointed out. If they had poisoned the wells, they would not be drinking from them. The bull had no discernible effect on the pogroms. By the end of 1349, Jewish communities had been destroyed in more than 300 towns and villages across Germany and Central Europe, the largest single wave of anti-Jewish violence in European history before the 20th century. The logic that drove these killings was not ignorance in the sense of having no information. It was the logic of terror seeking a target. When the cause of a catastrophe cannot be identified, a cause will be invented. When the cause cannot be punished, a substitute will be found. The substitute in 1349 was whoever was already feared and resented. It had nothing to do with wells. By 1350, the first great wave of the plague had largely burned itself out. Not because it had been defeated, Yersinia pestis cannot be defeated by human will or institutional response. It subsided because it had run out of new hosts in many of the areas it had already consumed. In 1361, the second wave struck, killing between 10 and 20% of those who had survived the first. It returned again in 1369, and roughly every 10 to 15 years for the next 3 centuries. The world that emerged from 1348 and 1349 was not the same world that had entered them. In the immediate aftermath, survivors found themselves in a landscape that had been physically transformed. Fields stood unplanted because there was no one to plant them. Harvests rotted unharvested. Livestock wandered roads without keepers. In some regions of France and Germany, entire villages simply ceased to exist, not destroyed by violence, but emptied of people, the houses standing vacant until they fell. German historians call these places Wüstungen, abandoned settlements. Archaeologists have identified hundreds of them. The economic consequences were stranger than the physical ones. Fewer people meant fewer workers. Fewer workers meant that labor was suddenly, dramatically more valuable than it had ever been in living memory. In England, France, and the Italian city-states, surviving peasants and craftsmen began demanding higher wages. Some simply walked off their feudal obligations and went elsewhere, knowing that any lord in any neighboring estate was desperate for hands. Landlords who had always set terms unilaterally found themselves in negotiation for the first time. Governments panicked. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, making it illegal for peasants to demand wages above their pre-plague levels. France passed similar legislation. Neither law was consistently enforceable against a workforce that knew precisely how scarce it had become. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, and a series of urban uprisings across the Italian cities of the 1370s and 1380s were all direct consequence of the labor disruption that the plague had created. The rigid feudal hierarchy that had organized European society for centuries began to crack, not immediately, not completely, but the pressure that would eventually fracture it had been applied in 1348 and 1349, and it would not go away. In the church, the plague left a wound that never fully healed. The institutional church had offered no effective response to the catastrophe. Its prayers had not stopped the dying. Its explanations had not satisfied the suffering. The authority of the clergy, which rested partly on their claim to mediate between God and the human world, had been visibly, repeatedly undermined by the simple fact that priests died alongside everyone else, and that many of them had fled or refused to enter the sick rooms of their own parishioners. Communities that had watched their parish priest abandon them in their hour of greatest need did not forget it easily. The spiritual fracture, generated by the plague, would feed over the following century and a half into the theological upheavals that eventually produced the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death did not cause the Reformation, but it loosened the foundations on which the medieval church stood, and the loosening never fully reversed, and the medicine began, very slowly, to change. Physicians who survived 1348 had watched bleeding, herbal poultices, and aromatic herbs accomplish nothing. The plague forced a confrontation between what medical theory claimed and what practice could actually do. It would take centuries for anything like germ theory to emerge, but the questions the plague forced about how disease moved between bodies, about the relationship between visible symptoms and invisible causes, are the same questions that eventually built modern epidemiology. In Siena, the unfinished cathedral stands. Agnolo di Tura kept writing until 1351, when his chronicle ends. He noted in his final entries that after the pestilence, people lived according to their own caprice. Everyone ate and drank and hunted and played games. Everyone seemed rich because they had survived. No one knew how to put their life back in order. He had buried his 5 children in May 1348. He was writing those final words less than 3 years later. He did not say whether he had found a way to put his own life back in order. He simply stopped writing. The unfinished nave of the cathedral was eventually repurposed. The city incorporated it into other structures. The ambition that had driven it, the ambition to build something that would outlast every generation that followed, did not return in Siena for a very long time. You can still stand in what would have been the nave and look up at the walls that stop halfway. The men who cut those stones died before they could place the ones above. The plague did not care about cathedrals, did not care about chronicles or papal bulls, or the confessions extracted by torture, or the letters that Jacob von Königshofen sent to posterity describing the burning in Strasbourg. What it cared about, what Yersinia Pestis has always cared about, in the precise biological sense, was finding a living host. In October 1347, it found one in a port worker on the docks of Messina who had touched the wrong ship. Within 18 months, it had found 30 million more. This story is not the only dark historic event that caused a lot of casualties. There is a lot to be told. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to take a look at the bizarre story about the Salem witch trials.